It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Welcome to your online coffee break, where we discuss bite-sized topics that inspire, educate, and entertain. Here's your host, a software innovator, award-winning marketer, and astronomy and space buff, Chuck Fields.
Hello, thanks for joining us today for your online coffee break. Today I'd like to welcome to our show my special guest, Dr. James Hansen. Dr. Hansen is a retired professor of history at Auburn University in Alabama. He's an expert in aerospace history and the history of science and technology. Dr. Hansen is the writer of First Man, The Life of Neil Armstrong, a biography which documents the life of the famous astronaut. First Man has been adapted into a movie by Universal Pictures and is directed by Academy Award winner Damien Chazelle, starring Ryan Gosling as Neil Armstrong.
Online coffee break.
Thanks for joining me today, Jim. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Now, Jim, I understand you've written several books and articles relating to aviation and aerospace. What drew you to that field?
Well, I graduated with my PhD in the history of science and technology from Ohio State in 1981.
Nice.
And just kind of out of the blue, literally, I get a call from the NASA history office, which I didn't even know existed at the time. And they were looking for someone to write a book about one of the earliest NASA research facilities. And, the job market being what it was, I had been applying for university positions, but I thought, well, this is interesting. It really sort of create a postdoctoral situation for me.
Yeah.
So I went and visited the NASA Center and talked to people, and went to Washington and met with NASA headquarters people, and decided that might be the best path for me. So it was really taking that first opportunity with NASA back in the early 1980s, and then once I did that first book, one thing led to another, and I just became kind of quickly, somebody that was recognized as someone who knew a little bit about the history of flight, both aeronautics and space, and so one opportunity just led to another.
Now, I know it wasn't easy to secure the rights to talk with Neil Armstrong about it. What led you to that, and how hard of a process was that to end up writing his biography?
Yeah, well, it was difficult. I could write a book just about how that all happened. Actually,
I bet.
It took a while. I think the key was that I was about 20 years into my career, not quite 20, but close to it. And so I had already published a number of books in the history of science and technology related to flight. And when I wrote to Neil, I just got it in my head that I wanted to do a biography. And a lot of the astronauts had already had their own, they had hired writers, or they had done their own autobiographies. And I knew that no one had done anything on Armstrong, and I had heard stories from my friends in NASA that Neil was, some called him a recluse, but it turns out that really I don't think is an accurate description. He was just a very private guy, and there was a lot of things that people wanted him to do that he decided not to. But I thought, I'll give it a try. I got an address, just a post office box address from where he was living in Lebanon, Ohio at the time. After leaving NASA, he had bought a farm outside of Cincinnati and became a professor of aerospace engineering in Cincinnati. So anyway, I got this address because it was hard, to even do that, and wrote in a letter, and he wrote me back a very nice, polite, just not at this time. He was very nice about it, but it was clear that he wasn't quite ready. And so what I did was I didn't entirely give up, but at the same time I didn't pester him because I knew that wasn't going to work.
Right.
So when his birthday rolled around in August, I think it would have been about the year 2000, I sent him a gift box that had 2 or 3 of my books in it, and I guess I was hoping that might open the door, make him reconsider a bit. But
nice.
At the same time, I think I felt it would be nice to have to know that Neil Armstrong on his bookshelf had some of my books.
Absolutely.
And so it was really him reading one of the books and writing back to me. And my work had always taken the engineering side of things seriously, even though I wasn't an engineer. I had written about topics that really related to engineering of airplanes and spacecraft. And so he knew I would take that side of him seriously. And I think in the end that was really a critical decision in going forward.
See, and I think that's amazing because when you did go forward, I believe you actually have 55 hours of recorded time with him. So you spent more time with him than a lot of people ever did in the history. So you got to see a side of him that I just could not imagine and think is incredible.
Yeah, that was key. I mean, the agreement between him and I, interview time with him was really essential. And, I did end up having about 55 hours of taping, but I did it over a long stretch of time because, interviewing and being interviewed can get quite tedious and tiresome. And,
sure.
and we were covering his entire life story, which at that point he was in his early 70s, I guess. Died when he was 82 in the year 2012. So
right.
What I would do is we would set up. I would come to Cincinnati for 3 or 4 days, and I would have sent him the questions in advance for those 3 or 4 days. And then when we were done with that, I'd go off and be interviewing other people or going into archives to read documents or whatever. And then another 2 or 3 months later, I'd come back to Cincinnati and we'd do another 3 or 4 days. And so that adds up, just in terms of the recording time, that adds up to about 55 hours. But I had a lot more time with him than that. That's just the recording time. And so I also, Neil was very good about email. And I was able to, if there were follow-up questions that I had, Neil was very good and generous about responding immediately to email questions. So as, if there were follow-ups that I had, a couple of times I might have bothered him with phone calls, but he was so good about looking at his email that I would just say, could you expand on this or, give me a little more information about that. And so in the end, I had, something like 800 emails from Neil.
Oh, wow.
And all of this, everything, the tapes, the emails, everything I have from him. When I was done with the book, I donated them to Purdue University, where Neil went to school. Excellent. And where Neil's papers also were going. And so everything I collected is accessible to researchers at Purdue.
See, I thought that was excellent. And I believe you had an interesting idea for Purdue University for how they could make those accessible to the public in the future.
Well, yeah, and it may still become a reality. The technology, it really was an idea that I had and had discussion with James Mullins, who was the head of libraries and archives at Purdue. And it would have been in the early 2000s. I had this idea that there would be a way technologically to sort of digitize everything related to Armstrong, including video and audio and documents and everything, and make it, with it all digitized, making that available where people on the internet could type in or speak in a question for Neil Armstrong, and the technology would cue through language recognition, word recognition, whatever, would cue an answer from Neil. And at the time, I remember Dr. Mullins at Purdue thought, man, that's really cool. We might have to look into that. But it really involves the technology of artificial intelligence.
Right.
You need to have algorithms that really are sophisticated, that can do this language recognition. And in the interim, in the 15 years or so since I thought about this, the technology for this has really been developed in a couple of different places, including at the University of Southern California, where I've been doing some work with them now. And it's really a way of actually creating an interactive conversation where you could have an app, or you could have a kiosk at a museum or science center, and you could basically activate the system, ask Neil Armstrong a question, and if you have all the database in there, and so you get an answer that queues up based on what the question was asked, and so you can sort of have a conversation. Now it gets a little more complicated because, unfortunately, we didn't. You could do this with my audio, but we didn't do additional video interviews. But through the use of avatars and holograms, you could actually create a virtual Neil Armstrong that would have real comments. It could be his real voice or a synthesized voice. So, the technology is now present where you could really create a Neil Armstrong that is available to us 24/7, which is maybe doing him a disservice because Neil liked his privacy a lot.
Right.
We could turn this trick on him and make him available to us all the time. So I think something like that in the next couple of years is going to happen. I'm working with this group out at USC, and we're going to see what happens with it.
Well, I think that's incredible. Now, back to Neil, I guess so many people, so many of us, including me, we just have so much admiration for him. There's so many stories that I knew of that a lot of people didn't, and I know you know a lot more. But I remember hearing for the first time several years ago about his loss of his daughter when she was just 2 years old in 1962, before going to the moon and everything, and just how that actually, I believe you said it turned him into an even more driven astronaut, which is incredible on that. Are there other rare stories about Neil that you hope your book conveys that you think people should know?
Well, I certainly, that revelation, I mean, that has become generally known. But when my book came out in 2005, the death of the daughter, or even the existence of the daughter, was not generally known. I mean, There were close friends of Neil's, fellow astronauts, who did not even know that he ever had a daughter, because it was something Neil didn't talk about with anybody, even with he didn't even talk about it with his wife, unfortunately. Wow. That's something that the book discusses and is actually shown in the movie as well. Yeah, I mean, there was Neil was kind of proves the old adage, still waters run deep. I mean, he was a very difficult person because he was so introverted and modest, but could be outgoing in certain ways and at certain times. But trying to bring his real character out to the surface so readers could see it, and now audiences in a theater can see it, is challenging. I mean, I guess I had certain notions about who he was, just based on everybody else had seen in the media, which wasn't much, and the space missions themselves, especially Apollo 11. And so it's kind of hard. I mean, one of the tasks I had as biographer was here he is, a very iconic figure, one of the world's great icons of the 20th century and beyond. But I had to, I had to try to learn and discover who the man was underneath the iconography. But at the same time, I wanted to understand, I was writing not just a biography, I was writing an iconography, because I wanted to study the cultural projections that had been placed on Neil, what society thought was true of Neil, because they maybe wanted it to be true, and
Yes.
There were all kinds of myths and stories that became attributed, even people that you would think would have told the truth, people that grew up with him, like in high school in Ohio. Some of the stories they told, you would think that they were accurate because, they actually did know Neil. Right. But it was like after he became world famous, by telling stories about him that maybe were a bit inflated in terms of the involvement of that particular person, you end up building up a lot of stories, and many of them turn out to be, some of them are totally wrong, and some of them are greatly exaggerating. And the only way I could, really find out what the case was to ask Neil specifically, because he's, in many cases, he was the only one that could tell you whether it's a true or false thing. And given his personality, I mean, he didn't go around, if somebody had been telling stories that he knew that weren't true, other people might want to go on the record and say, well, this is not a true story, and I want that clear in paper. But Neil wasn't like that. Neil just sort of, if people told stories, well, they told stories, and he just tried to ignore it as much as possible. But I had to try to sort through and see the facts from the fiction. And so that was what really surprised me, not so much about him, but how much that had been told about him was really not right, and I had to try to put all that together.
Now, see, I think that's fascinating, because I think one thing that really surprised me is, of course, I heard the rumors. Oh, of course, he's in a space growing up, and it was more he wanted to understand how airplanes worked and the engineering behind it. So he's definitely drawn, I think, to the engineering side of things.
Yeah, and it was really airplanes were the passion. I mean, I think one of the stories that sort of gets perpetuated after the fact is, that there were stories told that, well, Neil was really into science fiction as a boy, right, and he was very into astronomy and looking at telescopes. And those stories really just don't turn out to be very accurate. And because, I mean, what Neil was just he loved airplanes from the time he was a little boy. He built model after model after model. He went to Purdue to become an aircraft designer, so he entered an engineering program. He had a Navy scholarship, so 2 years into his education. The Korean War breaks out, so he has to report for flight training, and he ends up being a fighter pilot with a naval aviator flying 78 missions over Korea. And then when he gets back, he finishes his degree at Purdue, and the technology of flight, by now we're in the 50s, and the introduction of rockets and jets into the picture. And so what carries Neil into space is really not so much a personal decision as the technology itself is cresting in a certain kind of way. And as someone who's deeply become a trained professional and deeply knowledgeable about aeronautical engineering, he moves then into a test pilot role that takes him into the most experimental airplanes that are flying jets and eventually rockets in the X-15. And so by the time the space program comes along in the late 50s, early 60s, he's just kind of at the time in his life and his professional development that he becomes a part of that. So it really didn't take a decision for him as a boy to, I'm going to be going to space. I'm interested in the moon and the planets. It really wasn't the case. It was just his passion for airplanes and his professional training moved him along with the technology. So it was really that movement of the technology to the point of having rockets that could lift us off and get us out of the atmosphere that he just went along for the ride and taught us a lot about how to do it.
Well, definitely a fascinating story, and I could see why not only it's just an amazing book, but why it was turned into a movie. And as I understand, you were on the movie set quite frequently as First Man was being filmed. What was that like?
Well, I was there for most every day of the shoot, and it was exciting, but I can also say it was somewhat stressful for me because I felt such a responsibility to Neil. I mean, I was his only authorized biographer. I knew that that Hollywood, that movies were going to have to take certain liberties to make the cinema, the drama, make it a movie worthy thing. But at the same time, I was concerned about the movie makers taking things maybe too far, and where it wasn't, we'd no longer have the Neil that I would recognize or his family would recognize. So that made it a little stressful for me, because there were times I spoke up and had to have deep conversations with, screenwriter or with one of the producers. But overall, they treated me with great respect. They treated me as a important resource, and they still are doing that. And so I think we've come, now that I've seen the movie a few times, saw it again last night here at the Toronto Film Festival, and I'm very, very happy with it. I think they've done a tremendous job, and it's as close to the real thing as you're going to get.
See, I think that's excellent. Now, I know, obviously, you were in Toronto for that premiere. What's it been like seeing the premieres of the movies? What's the response been?
Well, it's always exciting to see how the audience reacts. I mean, it's been fun to see people that the movies, the shoot has been finished for a few months now, and I've had some interaction with the director and some people associated with the movie, looking at, making comments on the first cuts and things. But what's really exciting at the film festival is to actually sit in an audience with people that have never seen the movie and had nothing to do with making the movie, and seeing how they react, and watching the tears being wiped away in some cases, hearing the laughter at the appropriate places, hearing the great rounds of applause at the end of the movie. And then we stay around, and at a film festival, usually they bring a member of the cast and that come on stage at the end of the movie, and there's a person who leads a Q&A, a question and answer period, and the audience, we did this last night, and the audience, was so excited and interested in asking questions and learning more about it all. And so getting a chance to watch people watch the movie, experience the movie that you tried so hard and you put so much energy into, to have that finally, get that reaction back, is, it just really makes you feel good. And hopefully, all the reviews, virtually every one of the reviews has been a rave review of the movie, and it should, it should be a movie that a lot of people go see.
Excellent. Well, Jim, I cannot wait to see it personally. I'm just so thankful that you've written such an awesome book, that you were able to portray Neil Armstrong the way he really is, and then to consult on the movie set. I just think it's fantastic. And I know you're extremely busy. I just want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us today. Thank you so much.
No, my pleasure.
Online coffee break.
Wow, I really enjoyed my conversation today with Dr. Hansen. His book, First Man, is incredible. Highly suggest you pick it up at your favorite bookstore. And also the movie, First Man, is out October 12th. I personally cannot wait to see it. I hope you go out and see it too. If you'd like to find out more about the movie, you can visit their website at firstman.com. I want to thank Dr. Hansen for joining us today. I want to thank you for tuning in today as well. If you'd like to comment on today's topic, just go to our website, onlinecoffeebreak.com. Leave us a comment there. You can also call us at 317-862-4700. Leave a comment there. Who knows, we just might play it on the air. We'd also love it if you'd follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Online Coffee Break. And also subscribe to us using iTunes, your favorite podcast app. Thanks again for listening today. See you next time. God bless.